The Anderson Language and Technology Center at CU Boulder is committed to broadening and deepening cultural understanding. Alltech offers non-credit language classes in person and remotely to everyone year-round. Our flexible and engaging format makes language learning a breeze for anyone. So join a community of like-minded and motivated students who are passionate about traveling and experiencing the world. Jump into our summer session with a 20% discount using the code ALLTECHFUN. Learn more at alltech.colorado.edu.
Hi, my name is Tatum Verbrugge. I studied political science and international affairs at CU Boulder. As we all know, COVID-19 has changed the way we live and how our society functions in a lot of different ways. The education system especially has seen some of the biggest changes as students navigate the strange and often difficult world of online school. This panel will discuss how COVID-19 may actually be a necessary disruptor to the education system, as it has exposed many of the inequities that already existed. Our panelists will consider how the pandemic has provided an opportunity to reform the education system so that everyone has access to a quality education. So thanks so much for watching, and I hope you enjoy the panel.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Anthony. Thanks for joining today. Today, we'll be discussing on the panel Board of Ed, is COVID-19 the disruptor that education needed? Thanks again for joining the CU Boulder Conference on World Affairs virtual panel. Today is Saturday, April 4th, and we've invited some innovative and progressive educators to join us to discuss COVID-19 as the disruptor and accelerator that we need to help us in delivering quality education equitably. All of the CWA panels are being recorded and they're on YouTube. They'll be available to watch immediately following this panel here today. The audience is free to submit questions at any time. I'll be monitoring those, and after a set of introductions and a brief initial conversation, we'll be incorporating those questions into our discussion. Please share your comments and questions in the YouTube chat. I'll be monitoring those, and those will be what I share. If you're a CU student, please be sure to share that you're a student and where you're joining from. We try to prioritize student questions so that our panelists have a chance to engage with students at CU Boulder. For our panel discussion today, we'll begin with each of our panelists giving some opening remarks. I also am going to allow them to introduce themselves. And with that, I'm going to begin by introducing you to our first speaker who's joining us today. This is Jonathan Santos Silva. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Jonathan, to provide an intro.
Thanks, Michael. First of all, it's good to be here with everybody. I wish we could see you all. It would be fun to be in an auditorium, but these aren't those days. As Michael said, my name is Jonathan Santos Silva. I'm the founder of the LIBER Institute, which is an organization founded here in South Dakota to embolden and equip Indigenous students, families, and educators to transform schools and the communities they serve. I am also the chairman of the Board of Ed podcast, which lends its name to this panel today, which is focused on centering the voices of educators and community members who are most proximate to the failure of our systems, our education system, to provide an equitable education to all. By way of introduction, or by way of kicking us off, I offer the op-ed written by Joel Mehta, professor at Harvard, co-author of In Search of Deeper Learning, who wrote this op-ed last December in the New York Times and started off as hard as he possibly could, which was, if a measure of society is how well it takes care of its young, then the past 9 months are a damning indictment of our nation. He goes on to say that it's shameful to see, private schools holding classes under tents on spacious campuses while poor students are sitting outside of McDonald's to get internet access. if there's any part of that that I would push the honorable professor on, is that it's not just the last 9 months or the last year. It's really been since the inception of our education system. Systems thinking guides us to ask ourselves, to define systems not by what they call themselves, but by the outcomes they produce. And our system from its inception has produced inequitable outcomes for women, for Black students, for Indigenous students, and other communities of color. The same man who wrote the immortal words, "All men are created equal," advocated for a system, a two-track system, one for the learned and one for the laboring. And even today, we see how our school systems still function to sort kids into the opportunities it believes those kids are best suited for, not for the ones those students are most interested in. I was working with my daughter, my 5-year-old daughter, the other day. We were learning about the suffragist, Susan B. Anthony. And I didn't realize that one of the formative experiences of her childhood that put her on that track was when she came home and told her father that they wouldn't let her learn math because she was a girl, and he pulled her out of school and paid for a tutor. It was illegal, and most of us know this, it was illegal to teach Black folks how to read at one time in this nation. And today our children still lag behind in literacy measures. And we can't forget about our Indigenous brothers and sisters for whom education was predicated on the notion that the only way to educate a Native person was to separate him or her from his family, from his language, from his community, to punish him for manifestations of culture. And so when we look at a system today that doesn't equitably provide pathways to higher education or to other post-secondary opportunities, these are not mistakes, and these are not flaws in a system. This is a system that was built well hundreds of years ago, doing what it was designed to do. And so what this pandemic does, if anything, is it reveals to some of us who have the opportunity to live in, to pick our zip code and to locate in places where we know the schools will do well by our students. It's pulling back the curtain so we can see the Wizard of Oz and realize that behind that curtain, inequity is part of the programming of the computer. And so if we want to do it better, if we want to ensure that all young people and all families have access to something greater, we have to be just as intentional in our redesign efforts as the founders were in creating it in the first place.
Hey, thank you so much, Jonathan. Jonathan, we'll circle back to you after we go through the other speakers, but thank you so much for that introduction. The next person that I have that I'd like to introduce you to is retired Judge Bill Thorne. With that, Bill, I'll let you continue with your introduction.
Good morning. My name is Bill Thorne. I'm a Pomo Coast Miwok Indian from Northern California. I graduated from Stanford Law School in 1977, and I've served as a tribal court judge for 30 different tribes in a dozen different states, and then 14 years as a state trial court judge and 13 years at the State Court of Appeals. And I've been retired now for 7 years, and I'm working on trying to improve primarily the juvenile court system around the country. So thank you.
Great. Yeah, of course, Bill. And then the next individual that I would like to introduce is Anashay Wright. Anashay, please give a little intro into who you are and what you're bringing to the table today.
Absolutely. Can you guys hear me all right? Awesome. This is Anashay Wright, but by my former students and parents, I was called Anashay Teach 'em Right. And when I asked, so why do you guys keep calling me Teach 'em Right? And they said, well, Ms. Wright, you don't teach us wrong. And so WRIGHT, I have taken that with me. My name is Anashay. I am a proud African-American female that is representing Atlanta, Georgia, Decatur, where it's greater, the East Side, by way of Virginia, because it is spring break. And I'm truly honored to be here. I am the founder and chief disruptor for Disruptive Partners, where we simply partner with people who are ready to disrupt, interrupt, to get rid of old ways of doing and build new tables. We have no interest in invitations. We are about building new bridges, new connections, and new tables, because I envision a world where no one needs an invitation because they are positioned to build their own within their community. At Disruptor Partners, we not only set the people most proximate to the problem to lead their own revolution and transformation, we also set the people close to power and formal power structures up to receive 1 million Jonathan, Anashay, and bills at your door. And so we are just excited about the opportunity to be here, excited to join this conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, Anashay. The message of empowerment is definitely a takeaway that I think we want to hit on today. Basically, how is it that we can make our audience feel empowered to be disruptors of their own? With that, Bill provided a pretty brief introduction, so I want to circle back to him so that he can offer additional opening remarks. But to follow up from what you said, Anashay, Bill, if you want to touch on the ways that you've practiced disruption and fought for justice in the education system through your career, I think I would love to hear more about that.
Well, I think one of the primary motivators is something that Jonathan mentioned earlier, is that for tribal children, education was a weapon to be used against you. It was not an empowerment technique. And so children were separated from their families, sent hundreds of miles away, and then kept in schools that for the first 20 years actually prohibited teaching reading and writing, very much like the laws that dealt with African Americans before the Civil War. But these are schools that they took the children, said they need to be educated, and then refused to teach them reading and writing. In my more cynical moments, I think I understand why. It's because at that time, treaties were being written. And the only way tribal people knew what was in the treaty is what the negotiators told them. So if they couldn't read the treaty, they couldn't object to the treaty. Eventually, it got to the point where whole families were removed. And this isn't just 100 years ago. I have friends who, when they were in English class, had one book to share. And so their class was, you read a paragraph out loud and passed the book to the next person. We have schools still today that are condemned, physically condemned. We have schools that have less than half of the teachers that are authorized. So education for tribal children first was a weapon, and now it's a technique of deprivation. So one of the things I think that the disruptor that COVID has done actually forced the education system to innovate. Because until then, anytime you asked for change, the answer was a predictable, no, we can't do it that way. We don't have the money or the personnel to do it. COVID forced systems to innovate, and I hope that's a lesson that we don't lose, that systems can innovate if they're motivated. And a refusal to innovate is simply saying, I don't want to. So they've taught us that we can innovate on large scales, not just one at a time, but on large scales. So there's no reason, for example, that education can't reach out to families so that they have access, especially families that are remote or working and can't make those student-teacher meetings, or uncomfortable with coming in, that they can operate remotely. It's also not necessary to remove kids. Again, there are reservations where once the children hit 8th grade, they're shipped off to boarding school because there's no options for them. But now that we know about digital education, with all its flaws, is still better than separating kids from their families. And we have resources that can be shared now. I mean, you can have an expert in native learning in ecology and share that around the country without having to fly the person there. So we could set up a system where that speaker rotated among a number of different schools to engage the kids into something that they understand. That specialization now ought to be available to every child, so that if whatever you're interested in, the education system ought to find somebody who can connect with you and further your enthusiasm for learning. But it certainly has, I also identified the digital divide. You certainly read stories of kids who are huddled around the school building because they don't have Wi-Fi. Well, there are reservations that simply don't have anything but dial-up. And so even that is too slow. We have unsupported students and communities. And it's time to reward teachers who truly engage kids. Too many in the community thought that teachers were simply glorified babysitters. Now, when they've had to teach their own, they understand that that's not quite that simple. And if we have teachers who are truly engaging their students, making learning come alive for them, we ought to reward them. So I'll stop there.
Sounds good, Bill. So you mentioned the digitization of education that COVID has prompted. Anashay and Jonathan, I was wondering if you wanted to weigh in on the pros and cons of digitization of education that we've experienced over the last few months. As Bill mentioned, there is a number of good things and a number of bad things. And as we have been forced to innovate, we have to be mindful of who's being included in the innovation. Yeah, Anashay, I think Jonathan gave you the signal. Why don't you?
Yeah, I agree 100%, right? It has been both an accelerator and a disruptor in its own right. More concretely, what I've seen is that it's actually shifted the perspective of leaders, right? And what parents and families actually can do and the expertise they bring. And I'll give you an example. At my son's high school, shout out to Dr. Glanton. When it shut down, you were dependent upon family, upon community, this idea of collectivism, right? And making sure that the children were well, not just your child. And so what we saw were things like PTSA involvement, right? Going from an average of about 20, parents per meeting to nearly 100, increase of nearly 500% of involvement, which disrupted the lie that parents didn't want to be involved, right? It showed us that it's not an either or world, but it's a that and giving people options, right, to really be involved and be engaged, right? It's been just an amazing thing. I would say for me, it's really elevated the expertise that the people most proximate to the problems actually have, right? It showed that gone are the days of punitive discipline referrals, right? Because guess what? You need that mama on the other end of the Zoom, right? And now the mom on the other end of Zoom is now has direct insight to the work, right, of teachers as well. So what we saw was a power shift, right? Parents, partnered with teachers and educators in ways that were not just because we needed something, right? Another need survey or need. No, parents have brilliant strengths. And quite honestly, they're not stakeholders, they're shareholders. They are responsible for the bigger share of the system, which are the children. Because we all know there's a dollar amount connected to children, right? There's a brilliance connected to children. And so I think that COVID as both an accelerator and a disruptor has been what communities of color have been waiting for. We already knew this, right? We already knew about our collective brilliance and our collective genius, right? But we just needed everybody else to catch up. And so I think what we are really making sure that we do is that we do not go back to the way things were. We keep hearing people say, when things get back to the way they were. Absolutely not. Absolutely not, because we know that was not serving every child in a powerful way. And so I am just really excited to get people energized, organized, mobilized, so that we can strategically disrupt in a way that creates powerful experiences for everyone.
Absolutely. Yeah, Anashay, one thing that stands out to me in the statement that you just made is that the disruption of COVID, where students were taking their classes from home, meant that for the first time, parents were in the classroom along with their kids, right? They were sitting in front of the video screen, seeing what the work of teaching is. And I think that, there's so much evidence of empathy building that happens when we're able to see the work that someone else is doing and see that firsthand. I also know that parents really struggled having to be in the room during the teaching, right? That for many working parents, especially among our Black and Indigenous people, there was just a tremendous burden that was additionally placed on already burdened individuals. Jonathan, I'll let you jump off what Anashay said as well.
Well, I think both Anashay and Bill have done a really great job of pointing to some of both the pros and the cons of, this new virtual world. the idea, a lot of our reservations are hyper rural communities. And when you're looking to hire teachers, it's not as easy as, say maybe in Boulder, where you have like, hey, come to Boulder. We've got not just the school, but all these other industries or job opportunities. Maybe your spouse work at the university. And so like everyone has a space. When you come to a lot of our reservations, you don't necessarily have the diversity or the depth of economic opportunity, so that it's not just, can't just find a job at the school. I also need to know, what is my partner going to be doing?
Sure.
You know what I mean? And so now all of a sudden with virtual opportunity, and then this, I would argue this is probably similar in rural parts of the South, where all of a sudden you don't need to necessarily get that educator to move to your town. You just need to make sure that there's a solid broadband connection. And now that expertise is unlocked and is made available. On the flip side, I think one of the cons is more than, if we did not believe this already, I think we have to get real about broadband being a human right at this point, right? Like when schools went virtual, not all kids in homes had internet. So we have schools on Rosebud Reservation, for example. One of my schools that I love and support, Todd County Middle School, they're the Wildcats. The Wildcat wagon was driving around town delivering meals, delivering packets, and had hotspots on board so that kids could come out and download stuff and then go back inside and finish work. I'm like inspired by the innovation, but again, it's like we've got to do better, right? And so we see reservations that have bought radio bandwidth so they can broadcast internet. Like they're, so it's not for lack of trying or the desire to innovate, but giving someone a bunch of wood, no nails and no hammer, and say innovate me a house is a tall order, right? We've got to give tribes, we've got to give communities, we've got to give cities the tools to innovate appropriately, right? And so I think those are some of the pros and cons. I think it's opened up this concept of innovation. It's not innovation and design are not solely the purview of engineers, of the college educated. Innovation and design are the purview of all people who have concern for their children. It's just making those playing fields equitable and ensuring that the communities have what they need.
Yeah, so Jonathan, you touched on this concept of broadband as a human right. Bill, as a retired judge, I'm curious about maybe like legal strategies that are rooted in equity that you've worked on recently, and kind of the legal component of promoting diversity, equity, inclusion in education.
Well, let me give you an example from the court system is that it's important to listen. I mean, all the things we're talking about, the innovation, but it's important to listen to the people you're trying to serve. You don't walk in and say, here's the answer. You can say, here are some ideas. And then trying to apply that in the court system, we found that as hard as remote Zoom hearings are, parent participation has gone up in the hearings, and more importantly, youth participation has gone dramatically higher. Kids are less afraid to tell the judge what they're thinking when they can do it by Zoom, as opposed to when they're standing in the courtroom and there's a marshal or a sheriff with a gun and handcuffs standing there. Makes a world of difference. Now, if we could use that kind of concept to say, okay, parents, let's have a meeting and talk about how is math going in the 4th grade? Or how is your 3rd grader reading? And hear what they have to say, and then say, not that that's your fault, but how can we do better? How can we work together to do better? I know I have a new appreciation. I help my granddaughter do her math homework on Zoom. So she and I Zoomed, and because I couldn't see her paper, she was reading me the question. And as she read the question to me, I realized she was thinking through how to solve it. And so all I had to do was help her connect those ideas. So there's a role for grandparents, for parents, for people who want to volunteer as tutors. You don't have to take hours out of your day now to do it. You can set aside 30 minutes, 20 minutes and say, I can help. But we need a system that encourages and accepts that help, rather than says, we're the experts, you all stay out of it.
Yeah.
Yes. Bill, I'm like clapping like I'm in church over here, Bill. Absolutely. It's been too many barriers getting directly to the people, right? And connecting the people to the power, right? So we had all of these barriers and these different things, right? And it's not a one size fits all, right? There are different needs that are indigenous to different communities, right? And so I think that is so powerful, right? We have spent so much time asking people what they need from a deficit lens. You know, we didn't ask them, but what's your demand, right? What is it that, you need from us, and how can you serve, right? Because we stand to learn something from one another. And then setting our communities up to be clear on what those demands are, right? Giving them space and grace, right? And so at the same time, my fear is that we swing the pendulum too far, right? And everything is virtual. To Bill and Jonathan's point, give people options. I don't want you, to tell me, prime example, we want kids to graduate and all get good jobs and go to college. Actually, no. I want my kid to graduate and have a choice between being a job creator and a job seeker, right? We want options. And so I just appreciate Bill's comment there, because you need to set people up to lead their own change. And you don't get to assign a value to what is a priority for the people. And so that is what we've got to remove, are these barriers that have been in the way for far too long, because we don't need to be saved from ourselves. We are highly intelligent. Give us the space, the time to get clear, to better understand the system and this foolish game that is perpetuating and how it has controlled us from this either or deficit thinking. We'll show you a better way. We are best positioned to lead our own change. Just let us get our own table.
Absolutely. Yeah, Jonathan, did you have some follow-up thoughts that you wanted to touch on?
Well, what Anashay just said about our, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Southeast Asian communities not needing to be saved from themselves. I think that a lot of time prior to the pandemic, we would point to bad teachers or bad schools. It was very much a deficit base of putting the onus on the community. Like the failure is somehow inherent to this community. And so the only way to solve this problem is for us to pay someone who has certain letters after their name or has published a book, because we know we worship that written word, we're going to pull someone from New York or LA or DC, which is not Pine Ridge, South Dakota, or which is not, Coche de Pueblo in New Mexico, and they're going to tell us how to fix our problems. With the pandemic, I feel like it could have been a curse, but it turned out to be a blessing, was this realization within communities that no one is coming to save us right now, because everyone is going through. And so all of a sudden, all of this content, text, expertise, our elders, the parents themselves, the coaches, the loved ones of students were relied upon, and they were given access. And we realized that all we ever needed to solve our problems, most of it was already here. And to Bill's point, we can use partners, we can use content experts who are willing to listen and truly partner with us, but we don't need someone to come in here and dictate to us what we want or what we need for our children. And so that's why I was snapping and clapping off, because I think one unintended consequence of the pandemic has been the dislodging that notion that communities somehow needed to be fixed. The community isn't broken. The system, the schools, they are broken. The courts, they're broken, right?
Yeah, and
I
think
part of that brokenness is the notion that one size fits all that Anashay was talking about, was that we will present lessons in the classroom. If you are not successful, that's on you. Now we recognize that there are a lot of different ways of educating. There's the experiential learning, there's virtual learning, there's in-person learning, there's coaching from outside. There are all kinds of ways of doing it. But if we no longer accept the view that if you don't succeed, it's your fault, and instead, who are supposed to be the professionals? Who are the people who, as Jonathan said, have letters after their name? Isn't it your responsibility then to say, I will figure out how to make it so that your child has a real chance to succeed, instead of demanding that they meet me where I'm comfortable. My responsibility as the professional is, how can I serve and help you succeed?
Yeah. And I think going to this idea of getting out of a perspective of scarcity or deficiency and into a perspective of abundance, saying, even if you are one of those professionals with letters after your name, what can I learn from this interaction? What can I take from the students that I'm working with? What can I take from the community I'm working with?
And what's my responsibility to them? Because my
That's right.
responsibility is not just to get a paycheck. My responsibility is to help each child succeed, even if they have different paths to get there.
At some point, you have to ask yourself, as an educator and a leader, what is it that you truly believe from the inside out about the people that you serve, not save, right? And this savior mentality, because guess what? A kid falling asleep on Zoom, let's just pause here, right? Is it a chance that it could be your instruction, right? And it's not a slight to you. It's like, ask us what we think, right? Ask us what we're experiencing, and we'll tell you. Right. And the other thing is, it just blows my mind. I would never give Jonathan or Bill advice that an OBGYN should be given. Right. Or not an OBGYN, that another expert in the medical profession should be given. Right. I wouldn't give you accounting advice. I wouldn't give you tax advice. So how is it that people who are not proximate to us at all are giving us advice on the things that we are the experts on, and then don't want to compensate us? Right. And so it's again about this disruption of setting it up where not only do you get our advice and expertise, right, and you listen, you reallocate that funding and that money to pay the people that are the real experts on the real issues in their community, which is us. Right. And so I think we just have to be real when we look at the disconnect between these, the leaders and the white males. And again, co-conspirators, I love it, right? My white co-conspirators, they say, hey, is there a space for us? Like, what do we do, And I say, let me tell you what you do, my dear CEO co-conspirator. You bring me your car, you fill it up with gas, and you might have to hop in the trunk or the back seat. You let us drive. There's still space in the car. You just ain't driving it, right? And that's the thing. It is room for everyone, but you have to be willing to cede power, center power, right, and reallocate it so that everybody is able to activate and leverage the power that we all bring collectively into our community.
I used to tell state judges when they would ask, how can we help tribal courts? And I would define ally very much in the way that Anashe has done. An ally is somebody who doesn't speak for you, but speaks with your voice when you're not in the room.
I love that. We are starting to get a few audience questions. So I'm going to bring up one that we got, which is, given that the school system will likely be back to in-person in the fall, is it likely that we'll be going back to the system as usual? And how is it that we can continue with the disruptive momentum that COVID has helped to spur?
I think that's the most likely outcome. The system is designed to get the outcomes that it gets. And so without the presence of the pandemic and the restrictions that it placed, it is most naturally going to go back to what it was, which the status quo is a preservation of a white supremacy system, right? The system advantages certain identities and disadvantages others. And so the point Anashe made earlier, let's get back to normal, we'll get back to normal. That's fine if normal was working for everyone. That's fine if normal was equitable, if normal meant all schools were funded and resourced and staffed to what they need, not to what is equal, right? Because that's another part of it. One of the enemies of equity is the faux progressive notion that, hey, everybody's getting the same thing. What now we're going to be reverse racist? Now, we're going to give them extra stuff because they're Black. We're going to give them extra stuff because they're Native. And it's like, if I made some really tough steaks and gave everyone watching on YouTube the steak, but a portion of y'all didn't have forks and knives, and you come to me and say, I need this tastes nice, but it's a little rough. I need a steak knife. And I go, hey, everyone else already had steak knives. It would be unfair for me to give you some, equal. I didn't give anyone steak knives, so you just have to suffer. That's what we do in our schools every day. Certain kids come to school, they have more family support, more resources, they have less exposure to adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, less trauma. And then we go, well, the other schools aren't getting mental health professionals. The other schools aren't getting one-to-one. So why are we doing that for y'all? We have to just totally displace that notion. We're not going to get anything other than what we have if we're not intentional. And so how do we disrupt that? One of the greatest ways we can disrupt that, honestly, is white people stepping up and not accepting a return to the normal. I think it's important that Black communities, the Indigenous communities, Latinx communities, Southeast Asian community, other LGBT community continue to keep their voices heard. It's important. But we see how our nation responds when those groups voice their concerns. When Black people overwhelmingly peacefully congregate, we have more concern. We find violence, we find offense in places that it isn't. And then when white folks violently assemble and storm our sacred spaces, we have excuses, right? And so it's not going to be enough just for Black folks to advocate for Black folks, or Indigenous folks just to advocate for themselves. Not because they're not powerful, not because their voices aren't important, but because the system is set up in a way that it privileges white voices. So we need our white allies, accomplices, co-conspirators to say, my kid's going to the good school in our neighborhood isn't enough. Yeah. Why isn't that school on the other side of town getting everything my kids get? And it's going to take people to get a little bold. I think what we need to see is if there are folks that are willing to truly put their money where their mouth is and work in the schools and send their kids to the schools that aren't being served in the same way. Because if you have an average school, elementary school with 250 kids, if they're all poor, Black or brown, there's ways that we can excuse that. We're going to start blaming. Well, the parents don't show up for conferences. The parents don't do this. The parents don't do. If you got a 20-member, a white congregation that moves in and says, hey, we need to fix this stuff for all our kids, ears perk up. And it shouldn't be that way. It ought not to be that way. Anna Shay showing up or Bill showing up for his granddaughter or me showing up for my should be enough. But until it is, we need our white co-conspirators and allies to step up to the plate and demand it with us, to the point that Bill said, not for us, but in the spaces where we're not.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I got to build on that. You are absolutely right. It is a multi-pronged approach, okay? It is a multi-pronged approach, right? So phase one, and you got two critical power sources. One that is definitely not tapped, truly untapped, right? Which are your stakeholders and your shareholders, right? So you have to shift behaviors at the leadership level, and you have to shift behaviors at the stakeholder level, right? And I'll give you one concrete example. There are existing structures that are not being maximized and utilized in powerful ways. And you have things like parent-teacher associations, right? These things where naturally you can get a good amount of parents, but when you get there, we've been talking about one-off events, right? The fundraiser or the bake sale, right? What we did not talk about was how to systemically and economically get powerful, right? Do we spend time on the bake sale, or do we spend time on getting a 501c3 and then going for that 100K grant? And so people would like to think that these things are just also new, but it's actually not, right? It's what rich, affluent moms who get mad do all the time. They get mad, they build a charter school. They get angry, they know the system. So we have to shift these orientations, the orientation of the leader from seeing parents as problems sometimes to actually their best, most powerful partner outside of the system. That's number one. Number two, the stakeholder behaviors. Even getting our stakeholders to believe by activating and building on the momentum to better organize and activate their power, right? Because we have been conditioned to believe in inferiority. When we are Black people, we are truly, people of color are some of the most powerful, powerless people because we don't understand our collective power. And so I think while we want the dominant leaders, right, to do this thing, I just need you to give me my people and give me a space. Give me my people And that's why I joined the PTSA as the president, right? I was okay, let's learn what these existing systems and structures are. Let me learn the rules of engagement and disrupt them and make them really work in powerful new ways, right? I'm not playing nobody's game, I'm learning it. And so now we have to make sure that everyone else learns it, right? So that when the superintendent, I would tell my parents, well, if the superintendent call you tomorrow, what are your 3 demands, right? Let's take white people out of this, right? Let's just talk to us, right? Do we even know our 3 collective demands that are for the greater good, not just your kids? Yeah. And so step 1 is giving us space to be prepared. And number 2, to prepare these top CEOs to be ready, because we are coming, right? We are coming, and we want to partner with you, but we're okay with doing something different too. And so we just have to lean into that, because COVID showed us it was the disruption we've been waiting for.
Yeah. So I have a question that came in from.
I'd like to add to that, if I can. In the spirit of John Lewis, it's time to get in good trouble. I mean, the discussion changes when you're in the room. When you're not in the room, nothing changes. But when you're in the room, whether you're a parent or you're a community advocate, or you're, God forbid, you're somebody within the system who wants change, those discussions start to change. But as long as we stand on the outside and complain, not much happens. It's time to get in that good trouble.
Absolutely. So I have a audience question that came in, which is just recognizing the fact that many students have fallen behind over the course of the pandemic educationally due to the digital divide. Bill, you touched on this early on in one of your introductory statements about the fact that broadband is limited on reservations, access to technology is somewhat restricted and limited. How is it that we ensure that with the increased digitization of education, that students get the digital tools that they need? And also, too, we've recognized that many students fell behind because social services that schools provided were not being provided. How is it that moving out of the pandemic, we can help to address those students that fell behind over the last year?
I think the first step is we look beyond education system for new partners. I mean, if you're talking about getting, for example, broadband service, there are now satellite companies that are beginning to extend broadband. How much could they benefit from the publicity of joining with education to provide service in Indian country? How much better could food service do with their advertising if they decided to partner with food banks or fertilizer companies providing farmers food that they can share? I mean, it's part of the problem is education is said to the parents and the communities, stay out of it, we're the experts. We need to bring in all those other non-traditional partners and then demand education, say, how can we be a part as opposed to stay out of it?
I just want to get in there real quick because this is just the premise of the question. I get where it comes from. Kids are falling behind, but the reality is that so many of our kids been behind. I just know about it, right? Because now the kids who are falling behind, right? The system worked for them. They showed up every day. They got A's and B's, and then you put them on a computer, and that didn't meet their needs, and they're struggling in a way they hadn't before. So to be honest, if this is the first time you're seeing it, it means that child was privileged in the sense that the learning style of school met their learning needs. For so many of our kids, it never was working, and it's 2 parts of that. One is we have these standards that are imposed on us, right? Most of our communities have no say in what the standards are. We didn't say we wanted to test the crap out of our kids, that we wanted to spend 6 weeks out of the year testing, meaning that 180 days is not really 180 days anymore. And nor did we want the bulk of their education to get focused on stuff you can fill a bubble on, right? So much of education has been streamlined away from stuff that's meaningful, that's hands-on, that prepares them for life and critical thinking and collaboration, because that stuff is harder to test. So number one, we have communities that have been really struggling under that because they're not getting exposure to like deeper thinking. And then on the other hand, you have the fact that those standards that were imposed on us displace standards that have deep value and meaning to us. And I say this again, with my work with tribal communities, there are values, there are bodies of knowledge that have great meaning and importance to tribes that have just got wholly pushed out. And so you're saying that kids are behind, and the tribe is saying, yeah, they've been behind. They don't speak our language. They don't know our ways. You don't incorporate that. They're going to learn about Romeo and Juliet and some old dead white people before they ever learn about who we are. And you can say, well, that belongs at home. But how many white parents have to teach their kids about Thomas Jefferson and crap like that at home? They don't have to, because they can trust that there is a relationship of stewardship between the school and them, that I know that you're going to ensure that my kid gets what they need from you. Right. And so, so I get the premise of the question, but I pushed back in the sense of saying it wasn't just these last 12 months. It's way before that.
And right. There's something those other communities. Go ahead. Let's say.
No, I'm sorry. Who says everybody's at a loss? First of all, right? Because I can tell you definitely for sure some wins, right? One win is executive functioning skills, because my 15-year-old now knows how to use a transcription app on Google Doc, and what was taken 400 years to do, writing it out, right? He can now speak his paper and be smart, right? This educational system has mass produced a nation of compliant participants instead of independent thinkers, right? And so, you know, it's like, okay, if you got to sit here and wait for a teacher to input something for you to learn, that's problematic. And the word standard, really? I mean, who the heck want to be standard, right? That's not like, you know, that's the entry point if you're into that, right? But I think we have missed out. Everybody's not at a loss, right? And it depends on how you define the value, right? Who gets to define what the loss and the value is? Because I can tell you, you know, some basic things like having teachers do a one-pager with computer links. They weren't thinking critically because they had been complying to the standardization of evaluations, tests, right? And then things hit the fan. You're like, oh, Lord Jesus, who's going to come help us, right? You better save yourself, and you better get with the people, because we've always been the plug, you know? So I think that is something to say, the learning loss. I'm like, okay, relative to what? Are you talking about reading? Let's like really parse out and unpack what you mean by that, because everybody is not at a loss. We've gained time to sit still and see the two pandemics of racism and COVID, right? And see how they partnered. COVID and racism wolfed our tail. They got together and said, take that, right? And so we better learn from the master disruptors, because the next disruptive moment is around the corner. And again, we cannot go back to the way things were.
Absolutely. And Bill, it sounded like you had a follow-up thought too, so I'll let you jump in if you had something you wanted to add.
You know, I did, and I got so caught up in what Anashay was saying that I lost that thought completely, because I absolutely agree with everything she just said.
No problem. I have a few things that are pinned down too. Prior to the panel, we had discussed briefly in some introductory discussions the Indian Child Welfare Act. And Bill, you had mentioned that you wanted to bring it up here. Can you talk about how that might relate to improving the quality of education for Indigenous students?
Well, the big difference in the Indian Child Welfare Act is that it required active efforts, actually doing something to solve the problem, as opposed to so-called reasonable efforts. Reasonable was based on budget, the way we've always done it, so-called cooperation. The Indian Child Welfare Act required active efforts, doing something to solve the problem, engaging that particular family, as opposed to this is how we treat everybody. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals just tossed that out as a requirement on the notion that the federal government cannot tell states how to spend state resources. Well, what the response then ought to be is states then coming forward and saying, well, we like that idea. That serves our community better. We can make that a state law rather than a federal law. If we could apply that kind of active efforts thinking to education, where it's not just we're providing you a service, we're not even providing you an equal service. Instead, we will provide you a service that helps you succeed. If we could do that and provide that to each student, because even within a family, kids are different. They learn different. They have different interests. If we could design a system that actively sought to engage each child in what they're enthusiastic about, and fill in the gaps with other stuff, because everybody needs to read, everybody needs to be able to balance their checkbook, but we ought to give them a chance to succeed at what they're interested in, and then connect them with people who can nurture that. And that may not be the classroom teacher. I mean, COVID has told us you can do things remotely. So shouldn't the goal of the teacher then be to say, Johnny over here is really interested in the ocean and ocean life. I ought to be able to connect him with somebody who can feed that imagination. And so over here is really interested in dancing. Well, I can't teach you dancing on Zoom, but I can connect you with somebody who can do that. So our role of teachers might change into facilitators rather than as being the source of all information. So it becomes active efforts, active teaching, not just lay it out and see what happens.
Absolutely. I think that goes to a huge point that Anashay brought up early on in the call, which I'd love to get back to, which is this idea of how do we turn students into job creators? How do we turn them into independent thinkers? How do we work on those frontal cortex key assets that are going to make them successful adults? Bill, early on in the call, you mentioned an example of how early on education in Indigenous communities was a disempowerment mechanism, that it was not an empowerment mechanism. And so I'm just curious, I want to send it back to Jonathan and Anashay. How can we switch from an education of a disempowerment system to an education that's an empowering system?
I always start with the power of words. And if I can empower you, I can disempower you, right? To break that word down, empower is to give power. We don't need to give Black people, Indigenous people, Latinx people, Southeast Asian people, LGBTQ or women power. They have power. What we need to do is start to speak differently about what power is. Power, if you go into from a broad-based organizing perspective, is power is defined as the ability to act. And we define it that simply, there's a lot of unrealized power, unactivated power. That's why we don't say in our mission to empower and equip Indigenous students, it's to embolden. How do we get you so fired up about what you see before you, what you've been forced to accept, that you won't accept it any longer? How do we then equip you with strategies, with skills, with partnerships, with bridges, so that you can begin to work out for yourself what that future state will look like? That is what we're talking. So it's one thing to talk about. I think, Bill's example was incredible. When families and students are beamed into court and they feel more emboldened to speak, to make contributions to their own decision, then I think that the court will make a better decision. You see that where we have schools on the reservation where, not all our kids live within walking distance of school. They may be 40 miles away from school. And so parent conferences can be an obstacle. We have schools that are all of a sudden having 100% participation, 90, 95% participation. So now those conferences, the outcomes look different, right? So how do we make sure that we, like we said earlier, don't go back to normal, but we think about these innovations out of necessity as innovations of improvement? Like, how do we maintain this so that the future state looks fundamentally different than the current or the former state? And we're talking about parent engagement, community engagement. I think it's the same thing for students, right? I love, and by love, I mean, actually, I hate to hear educators and other adults talk about how student-centered they are. Then when you ask them, well, how many students you talk to, they didn't talk to anybody. What they mean is that they're student proximate. I'm around young people. I teach, I'm around them. I'm a principal. I see them, but I don't ask them what they want. I don't engage, in confrontation and contestation about, hey, this is why I made this policy, but how are you experiencing the policy? The students can say, yo, mister, this policy is whack, and here's why, right? I remember talking to principals who built out their complex schedules for high school, 3-minute passing. And then we encourage that principal to shadow a student, and she's like, I cannot get from the 4th floor to the 1st floor and hit the bathroom to get to class. So all those referrals about tardiness and you're in trouble and you're always tardy, you never make it here, was a function of a top-down decision, as simple as how do we maximize time, right? Sounds great. We want to have maximize our minutes, the most time in class. But without student input, we never realized how adversely we were impacting kids. And that's just passing period. Imagine if we took that level of intentionality around not just passing periods, but hiring, allocation of resources, how the day is structured, right? If we did that and we were intentional about listening to students and not just entertaining them to say, I'm listening for keywords, and if once Anashay says what I want to say, I'm going to go back and do what I was going to do. No, I'm actually going to listen to this all the way to the necessary conclusion. And even if it's a little uncomfortable, we're going to make some changes. That's when we get radical shifts. That's an emboldening experience for young people, because if those young people feel like they can speak up about school, then what else do they confront?
And continuously, not just that one moment or that one meeting, but continuously.
Yeah. So I want to build on that right there. The question is, right, what can we do? So at Disruptor Partners, we have the Disruptor Partners, right? And those are those individuals that are proximate to the money and the resource and the power. And they actually lean into that. Tell the truth, right? You know you have access to money, power, and resources, right? I'm not going to negate your humanity. I need you to embrace that and think about how you can have a system set up where you're consistently aligning it and have a checks and balance with the people that you were hired to serve, not save. That's number one, right? We need partnerships that disrupt the current state. Now, my people that are the real MVPs are my authentic disruptors. Those are the ones who are on the ground every day, making big and small moves. And when I think about what the authentic disruptors, what we, the everyday people, should be doing, it brings me back to my mother raised me to be a disruptor. And the number one thing that we can do is question. My mother wrote a poem in 1991, and she said, rules, who are they made for? And one of the questions, she said, who are they made for? Right? The people in power, position, or fame with the canny ability to use their name to make things change just because of their fame. Who are rules made for? When you get angry, step one, you better unpack that thing. You better unpack and think about and ask the right questions. From there, you better get clear in community so you are clear on your demands. I tell people to start with your 3 most powerful demands, and then you collectively lead. That is the power. And that's what we're working on now, is creating this masterclass where everybody gets a baseline foundation on disruption 101. And that's why I say we are coming, but it is in the question. We have taught teachers, we've even pushed teachers to be compliant participants. Oh, write him up because he used a profanity or he cursed. Or to Bill's earlier point, we can turn right back around and weaponize literacy, right? When my kids use the word damn, I gave them the book called The Hate You Give. And they looked at the book and was like, damn, we didn't know damn had an N in it, right? You know, so I use literacy as a weapon to disrupt. If they want you to write a letter to the superintendent. And so we have to give people the resources to leverage the power that they already have. To Jonathan's point, you can't empower me, baby, because I'm clear on what my power is, right? You just didn't want me to know it. And now that I do, I'm going to tell everybody, right? And so that's what we need to do.
Absolutely. Well, I'm sorry to call attention to the time, but we're coming to the top of the hour. I have a few things before the top of the hour that I need to go through. Thank you all so much for coming and being amazing contributors to this discussion about how we can meaningfully, positively disrupt education for equity. Thanks to everyone that's tuned in. Special thanks to all the speakers that volunteered their time to be with us today. If you would like to support them and learn more about their work, all of their bios, books, podcasts, and social media accounts are linked on the CWA website. CWA relies on the generosity of people like you, the audience, to make this type of event possible. Please consider making a donation to the Conference on World Affairs. That can be done at the CWA website, which is www.colorado.edu/CWA. Tune in through Sunday, April 11th. We're going to be having live sessions the rest of today and tomorrow. All of these live sessions will be recorded and accessible afterward. Thank you so much, and please tune in again in the future. Again, thank you so much to Anashay. She'll be teaching a masterclass coming up soon. Look for that release Jonathan, if you are interested and you in the audience want to continue with this conversation, look for his podcast, Board of Ed, and check out the Liber Institute. And Bill, thank you so much for all of your hard policy activism work.